Good morning and welcome to Nedgroup Investment Insights. Today we have a very special guest with us, David McWilliams, who some of you would have heard from before or seen present. David is a journalist, an author, just about everything but an economist. But he does on occasion give some good insight to the global economy. Today's topic that we've chosen is what David calls the Great Pandession, and how do we get out of that? And I think through Dave's talk, you'll start to hear what he means by that. Please note that you can, of course, send questions whenever you'd like. There is an icon on there that you can click and write. So I'm going to go across to Dublin. Hi, Davey. How are you?
I am great, Shaun. How are you, man? Are you all well down in South Africa?
Yeah, all good, all good. I see Ireland is probably a little more relaxed than we are with the lockdown.
Well, you know, we've just closed the window here to make it sort of look professional, but out there it's about 10 degrees. It's raining. It's windy. It hasn't stopped raining. I was actually just listening to the radio. It's going to rain for another 7 days. So, frankly, it's summer in Ireland, a la lockdown, and nothing has changed. You know, basically, I know you guys have the water shortages. We've got far too much of it. It's the usual carry-on. No, but life is good.
Yes.
The lockdown, Shaun, is lifting. So much so that, as I told you yesterday when you called me, I was driving to Belfast up the road to see the mother-in-law. As you'll know, Shaun, if you're going to see the mother-in-law, life is back to normal. Okay?
Well, I was going to say, pretty brave driving to Belfast and seeing the mother-in-law. I think I would rather have gone shopping now that the shops are open. But
well, Shaun, I do remember the last time you and I went shopping in Cape Town, I forgot my suitcase. Do you remember that BA forgot my suitcase? And we decided that we'd go in as two expert tailors into some swanky pants place with your missus and get me kitted out. And I think the jacket was too big, the shoes were too small, and the shirt was too tight. So I looked like an Irish guy coming out of the pub on a Friday night. It was all good.
Well, looking at your attire today, it looks like you've lost your suitcase again, but we won't go into that.
I thought I'd dress up for you, Shaun.
Thank you very much. So just a couple of things, I think, just to get started. You know, we mentioned the lockdown. How is, you know, in the context of Ireland, or let's talk UK, Scotland and the surrounds, how has lockdown been? And on a more serious note, you know, kind of what are you seeing coming out of it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the lockdown was, I mean, it's an amazing thing when we think about it now, that on the 10th of March, Shaun, we were all going around doing our business, and then suddenly we closed the economy down. And the interesting thing is we can do that. That's the most interesting thing. The lockdown has been a kind of a pain for most people. What has basically happened, Shaun, is it shines the light economically on two sectors, right? We have the government sector and the big companies. They're doing fine. They're going to be okay. The problem here and in the UK is small businesses, because small businesses run out of money. They run out of capital. They run out of cash. Small businesses are, in this part of the world, about 60% of GDP, 50, 60%. They also tend to employ a hell of a lot of people. And the big question, Shaun, is how do they come out of it? Because, you know, large companies can avail of QE and they can avail of their treasury and they can do this. Governments can borrow. But if you're a small guy and you have a big payroll and you're basically going month to month, week to week, you've not very much capital buffers, the summer looks like a big problem for you, because as we open up, it's going to become apparent that a lot of your creditors, a lot of your suppliers will not get paid. You might not pay them. So that's a big problem, Shaun. And that's something we're looking at here in Ireland. And it's in the UK, it's exactly the same thing, because our economies are structured very similarly. I think it's the same in South Africa. So you've got this situation where small companies are finding it very, very difficult to see a way through this. The implication of that, Shaun, is very high levels of unemployment as we come out, very high levels of welfare checks as we come out, and a sense that, you know, the problem with small companies, Shaun, is that when small companies go bust and go bankrupt, not because of bad business, but because of COVID, they don't open up. You know, a company is like a social organism. You've got your investor, you've got your owner, you've got your manager. Let's say you're a small cafe, you've got your waiters, waitresses, you've got your customers, you've got your suppliers. So it's like an entire social organism. And once that shuts, Shaun, I think it's very hard for those to reopen. So the way in which we should frame the discussion is two things: is the big economy, the markets, for example, and then we've got the real economy, the little guys, who really employ most people. And they're really going to hurt, not least because you forget that the economy, Shaun, is very social, very, very social. You know, we're chatty individuals. So when you shut us down and you say, well, you can't meet in any groups that are 2 meters apart, well, that kind of shuts down tourism, it shuts down hospitality, bars, retails, all that sort of stuff. So I think what we're going to see, Shaun, in the next 12, 18 months is a massive focus on small businesses here in this part of the world. And the lockdown has really knocked the stuffing out of them. I mean, I take even the case of Ireland, for example. Ireland has a population of, what, 5 odd million? I think we had 7 or 8 odd million tourists last year. We'll have no tourists this year. Same thing for the UK. You know, the London economy, although there's a lot of finance, a lot of it's tourism and visitors and all that stuff. So, you know, we're in for quite a rough ride. Quite a rough ride, unfortunately.
And Dave, maybe that's a good.
Yeah, go on.
Sorry, and I said, Dave, maybe that's a good segue into today's topic, which is what you call the great Pandession.
Yes.
And getting out of that.
Yeah.
You know, kind of in like what you said, what does history teach us about, I guess, the crisis we're going through today?
History is very, very. The good thing is, Shaun, relax, because history is very positive about how economies get out of pandemics. I call this a pandession because I think language is very important. It's very important to define where we are. And economics has never seen this before. We've never seen a recession or a depression which was brought about explicitly, Shaun, because of a health scare. That has never happened before. If you go back to history, if you go way, way back, which we might do, but if we go back to history, what we see is that all these pandemics were largely accepted as we'll do a little bit of social distancing, but we're not going to shut the place down. This time around, I think it was a fear, maybe largely driven by what happened in Italy, that the ICUs would get completely overrun. And as a result of that, we all said, okay, we're locking down, we're going to protect the ICUs. Now, therefore, what do we call it? We call it a pandession, a recession brought about by a pandemic. Years ago, I worked for Jack Welch, remember the great GE executive? And he said that in a crisis like this, you've got to do 3 things, Shaun. You've got to define 3 things. He says, right, one is define your reality. Second is not as you would like it to be, but as it is. And the third thing then is, Shaun, you've got to do something about it. And if you see something like this, we've got to say, okay, what does history teach us? Now, history teaches us something very interesting, Shaun, which is that if you go even all the way back to the Black Death, right? 1347, Shaun, I know you're a great history man. I know you've always been interested in these things, but the Black Death destroys 1/3 of the European population, 1/3. And the implication then was that, you know, Europe would actually go into some sort of trauma afterwards. But the opposite happened. What actually happened after the Black Death is you get this great flourishing of Italian literature, of Italian thought, of humanism. You get the Renaissance. Within a generation after that, you get the printing press, you get the discovery of the United States, etc., or America. So after the Black Death, the world responded incredibly positively to what was a trauma. And then you say, was that a one-off, or is there more information? And you go back to 1918, Shaun, to what the Americans called the Spanish flu, okay, which happened in 1918. In actual fact, it should be rightly called the Kansas or Arkansas flu, because that's where it came from. That flu came from America. It was a swine flu. That swine flu was probably picked up by farming kids in Arkansas and Kansas. Those kids then went to Kansas, to the American Military College on the call up for the First World War. They then went to France. They infected the Brits. The Brits infected the French. The French and Brits prisoners of war infected the Germans. And what actually happened was Germany and France and Britain said, man, we cannot tell our people that there is a flu destroying our soldiers, so we won't report on it. And the only big country in Europe, Shaun, at the time that was independent and was not in the war was Spain. So the Spanish reported on it, and as a result of that, it was called the Spanish flu. Now, let's look at what happened after that, Shaun. That was an extraordinary pandemic, killing hundreds of millions of people worldwide, millions and millions of Europeans, millions of Americans. And again, you would have thought that this would have caused trauma. But look what happened after it in history. You had the roaring 20s in the United States, okay? The reaction technologically was phenomenal, right? Think about the United States in the 20s. You get the introduction of electricity. You get the introduction of the radio in terms of communication. You get the introduction of the Model T Ford, a car for everybody. You get this massive stock market boom. You get a cultural expression. So what you get is you see the people reacting to the pandemic in an extraordinarily positive way. In fact, you see the same thing in India. The Indians reacted to the pandemic by setting up the Congress Party in India. So you've got all these strange things happen. And my sense, Shaun, is that we will, once we're over this in a year or two, react in an incredibly positive way. And I think that's what history teaches us, that when humans get faced with something as unbelievably traumatic, that we don't actually go into our shell, then in actual fact we come out. But the question then we have to frame, Shaun, is how do we get from here to there? How do you get from, are we going through a second wave, to what happens to the world when we get out of it? And that, I think, is we should focus on. It's the next, anybody can tell you what's going to happen in 10 years' time, because that's high speculation. But it's the next 10 months, 20 months. That's, I think, where we should be. And we'll focus on it. And I mean, the interesting thing is, I was just reading this for your delectation here, Shaun. It's a little book. I think this is the sort of book you should be reading now. It's the Communist Manifesto, right? The virus has done more for communism than Marx could ever do. And the reason is that we've actually suspended capitalism, okay? Capitalism has been suspended. Governments have come in, we're borrowing lots of money. The question then is, how do we get out of that? How do we reinstate capitalism, and what does it look like? And not only that, but how much is it going to cost? Who's going to pay for it? Is it inflationary? Is it deflationary? All that sort of stuff we can talk. So let's reframe the discussion, Shaun. History is kind to humanity with respect to how we get out of pandessions. However, our next 24 months is where we've got to think politically, geopolitically, markets, policy, all that stuff.
Thanks, David. And speaking of markets, the US market, of course, down 6% yesterday.
Yes.
We've heard Powell and what he had to say about interest rates, that they weren't even thinking about doing anything. But maybe markets aside for a bit, maybe we could just go and talk a little bit about the various regions, starting with yours. You know, in the UK and the EU, you know, Boris looks like he finally wants to have a very good talk with his friends. And I guess the big question is, you know, kind of are the pillars or the foundation of the EU, you know, being shaken, and how far gone is it? Okay,
well, I mean, let's talk about our friends across the road. You can almost see them on a good day from here, right? The Brits, okay? If you've got a pair of goggles on, you can see them. The Brits are in a total mess, Shaun. The pandemic, you know, the interesting thing about the pandemic is, you remember with respect to people and their exposure to the pandemic, the medics talked about these underlying conditions, right? That if you had these underlying conditions, you were more fragile in the face of COVID, and it made you, put you in a high risk group, right? Societies and countries also have underlying conditions, Shaun, and those have been exposed by COVID. So in Europe, you see the most socially coherent, the most efficient, the most technologically savvy countries are the ones that have reacted by far and away the best, okay? You see the countries that have underlying conditions, weaknesses, endemic weaknesses in the system, they've reacted very badly. And unfortunately, our neighbours are one of those. The Brits have these underlying social, political, regional, and we know now with respect to Brexit, national issues. Johnson has performed appallingly during this period. Now, in fairness, the poor lad did get COVID, and apparently he was very, very sick. But Britain has been characterised, Shaun, by a culture war, which is very odd for us to look at. So basically, where you stand on COVID is where you stand on Brexit. Okay, so the Brexiteers want to open up quickly, and they want to just besmirch the medical advice, and et cetera, whereas the Remainers don't. The European Union, with respect to Brexit, we're bored of them now. We're bored of the Brits, right? You and I know, South Africans will know this, that trade negotiations are all about power, okay? That the guy with the biggest stick wins, okay? Small countries in trade negotiations do not get to make demands. And the Brits have forgotten that in this context, they're a small country. European Union is 300 million people, Britain 60. That's it. That's the deal, right? So Boris and Cummings and all those unusual creatures are playing still to the peanut gallery, their own Brexit gallery. The European Union have been very explicit. They said, look, here's a deal. You signed it up for Christmas. It's got a couple of things. That's the basis. The Brits are backtracking. And what's interesting about the Brits, it seems to me, Shaun, is they haven't got over the fact that they've left the EU, right? And the rest of us Europeans are saying, okay, you've gone. Off you go, man. And they're still fighting that battle. So Brexit is not our issue, but that doesn't mean the EU has not got problems. The main problem, and you'll know this from your in-laws and your in-laws' family in Italy, the major problem is Italy. Italy is the number one fear in the European Union. And the reason is that, Italy is a bankrupt country. If you look at the growth rate of Italy, you look at the debt of Italy, you look at the prospective growth rates of Italy, this is a country that needs help. Is it a big Greece? I'm not sure. But it's certainly a country that without the ECB would have bond yields much higher. And it's also got Salvini, Salvini, the leader of the Northern League, waiting in the wings, stirring up lots of dissent. So the entire axis of the European Union has shifted towards Italy, Shaun, and saving Italy is now the only issue. And interestingly, Shaun, what has happened is that real leaders have emerged. So we take Boris Johnson. He's not a real leader. He's a columnist. He's a good 1,000-word column writer. He's not a leader. Angela Merkel, on the other hand, is a leader. Okay, and Angela has come out and said, okay, what do we need to do here? We need to issue European Union bonds issued by the European Commission, backed by Germany and France, which in effect means everybody, because when Germany and France say jump, we just say, okay, how high? Well, that's the deal, right? And that's a huge change, Shaun. That means we're going into a new phase of the European Union. That's the first phase. The political reality that Europe is going closer to some sort of fiscal union of some sort, okay? Then how do we, in the short term, help the Italians? And the very interesting, Shaun, is that what the Germans are very angry about, okay, in Germany, is the fact that they now realize that the ECB has been the victim of an Italian coup d'etat, okay? That over the last 10 years, the Italians have taken over the ECB. So if you look, ever since Trichet left 2012 and Draghi came in, look at every pivotal decision on the ECB Council. Look at the way the Bundesbank voted, Shaun, and look at the way the Bundesbank has been defeated on every single vote from the Euro crisis on. What has happened is the Italians, with the tacit backing of the German political leader in Angela Merkel, have used the ECB to basically turn the ECB into the Bank of Italia. And that is what's happened. So all this stuff, all this money printing, all this opening up the TTLROs, everything, that's Italian. That's not German. And that has led, Shaun, I don't know if you've been following it in recent weeks, to the German Constitutional Court having a serious go at the ECB about the legality of what the ECB doing. What the ECB is doing, basically, Shaun, is it's buying everything that can't be nailed down, right? It's going to buy everything, okay? It's going to backstop everything. The Germans are what I would call the ordo liberals, who are basically the intellectual basis of the Bundesbank, are up in arms. But frankly, they're like kind of Deutschmark jihadis. They're obsessed about a currency that no longer exists. The Deutschmark's over. So what you're seeing now in the European Union is a gradual realization that we have to come together in a more significant way. That involves really saving Italy, because if Italy goes, it's all over. Italy is a big country. It's 56 million people. It's a founding member of the European Union. It has an extraordinary industrial base in the north. It's the center of European civilization. You don't get European civilization without talking about the Roman Empire, yada, yada, yada. It's too big to fail. And at the moment, the ECB will keep it. You've heard about zombie banks, Shaun. Italy might end up being a zombie country. And it's kept alive by ECB financing. Will this lead to problems? Yes, it will. Is the imperative of keeping the EU together more significant than each country's own dilemmas? Yes, it is. So I think the The frugal four, the Germans, the Austrians, the Dutch, and the Finns, who are against all this mutualization of debt, I think they will find themselves on the back foot. And I think Mrs. Merkel has clearly signaled to everybody that European Union's preservation comes before all. As to what happens at Brexit, Shaun, I think the Brits might crash out. I think they might if they speak to their own audience. If they decide to rerun the election again through the prism of the final negotiations with the EU, I think they might crash out. It's hard for me to imagine a British government that would take such a ludicrous, self-harming approach, but they're not the same British government that they used to be. That's the lesson. And that's before our friends, the Scots, decide to go independent again. The latest poll in Scotland shows that 52% of Scots are pro-independence. The Scots are playing a very canny game, as they're doing. They know that the single biggest recruitment agent for Scottish independence is not anything the Scots will do, but is Boris Johnson. As long as he's in number 10, buffooning around, he annoys the Scots so much that even middle of the road Scots are going to the independence movement. So I think that's the next big thing. When it happens, is it a year or two? I don't know, but it's on its way. So we're in for interesting times in this part of the world.
Yeah, indeed. And maybe we can turn our attention a little to the US. Two things I'd like you to cover, and I'm just going to give you two words: revolution and election.
Well, listen, Shaun, I was listening last weekend to two speeches. One was given by a rapper called Killer Mike in Atlanta, and one was given by the President of the United States. When the rapper is deploying the language that used to be reserved for the president, and the president is deploying the language that used to be reserved for the rapper, the shooting and looting and thugs and dominate them. The rapper was talking all about tolerance, acceptance, civility. The president is talking all about shooting and looting. So when the president talks like a rapper and the rapper talks like the president, the United States is in a strange place. Very, very strange place. With respect to revolution, I'm not sure anymore. I do think that what is very interesting in the last couple of days is how the American military, Shaun, have become emblematic of defenders of the Constitution in a much more credible way than the American president. And that's an extraordinary thing. Trump clearly wants to fight the culture war. He sees, look, you cannot win an election with unemployment at 25%. Okay? Before COVID, Trump was thinking, I'm going to win, I'm going to go in and I'm going to fight this election on the basis of the lowest rate of unemployment ever. He's going to fight the election on the highest rate of unemployment ever. He has made a total mess of COVID, and he's made a total mess of race relations. My sense is that the United States will have a Democratic president in January. The question is, who is that person going to be? I think Trump is over. I think it's over for him, and I think he will lose spectacularly. And I think America and the world can breathe sensibly a little bit more. The question is it going to be Sleepy Joe? Is it going to be Joe Biden? My own sense is that if there's a risk that Biden doesn't win, or if, let's say in August or July or August, he's still displaying these characteristics of a guy who's not really mentally all there. I think the elders of the Democratic Party will tap him on the shoulder, Shaun, and they might ask him to move aside for the good of the country. So that, I think, is the next big move. It depends, though. If there's more shooting on the streets, if there's more black men killed, who knows what's going to happen? It's a very strange place, very, very strange place. But I think, again, looking through, Trump's gone. I really think Trump is gone. I don't see him. I don't think he can win. I don't think he can get past his 40% of the vote. And the extent of the Democrat victory depends on who they put in. I think if they try to put in someone like Mario Cuomo or Andre Cuomo, they could win hands down. Like a good street fighter will destroy Trump at the hustings. At the moment, Joe Biden isn't that man, but the fact that he's not Trump means that he's untainted by the last 12 weeks and certainly untainted by the last 4 years. So it's a different country to the country we know. And that's maybe our narrative all the time, Shaun, is all these countries are different to the countries they started out at the beginning of the year. All of them are.
Thank you, Dave. And moving right across to China now. I think, as you've seen, China have miraculously got COVID-19 under control, which
yes.
on itself is a whole subject. But I guess the bigger question, particularly as it pertains to the US, is, have we entered an era of a Cold War with China and the US? And, can China ever be as dominant as they maybe were before COVID?
No, the short answer is no. I think that basically, Shaun, we are in what I'd call Cold War II. So let's talk about COVID itself. We're now probably getting used to the fact that we're now living with COVID. It's not a before COVID and an after COVID. It's living with. It's like living. Remember the old thing, living with AIDS. When we were younger, AIDS was this. If you got AIDS, you were going to die. And then, of course, medicine changed, the antiviral drugs changed, and now people live with AIDS. Right? I think we're going to live with COVID. Geopolitically, though, the single biggest consequence of COVID, in my mind, is definitely the Cold War II. Now, basically, the question we have to ask ourselves, Shaun, is did COVID change the world, or did it just accelerate changes that were already there? Okay. One of the changes that was coming was this huge battle between the United States and China. We saw that all over the place. We saw that in Taiwan. We saw that in trade. We saw that in currency manipulations. And actual fact that one of the theaters of this battle could well be Africa. And now we're seeing the crystallization of Cold War II, which is basically between the United States and China. And it will initially start as a trade war. It could be a currency war. It'll be a rhetorical war. It'll be a propaganda war. But ultimately what happened, Shaun, was I saw one thing at the beginning of COVID, which was the following, which was European countries and the United States queuing up to outbid each other to get medical devices from China. That will never, ever, ever happen again. The Europeans and the Americans will never, ever, ever become as dominant or as dependent on the Chinese for strategic goods again. It won't happen. And I can imagine if you'd seen that picture on CNN of us queuing up to the Chinese, that was the moment where there's a tap on the shoulder in Berlin or in Washington, and one guy from the military says, that ain't going to happen again. Okay? So our dependence on China is over. Okay? That's the big story, right? And that means something phenomenal, that geopolitically the world migrates back towards the two zones, right? So what used to be the Soviet Union versus the Americans is now the Chinese versus the Americans. Lots of us will make a choice that we haven't made in the last 30 years, because the last 30 years, Shaun, was all about moving and shaking. Communism is over. We're democratizing. China's coming into the world. We don't have to make a choice. We can therefore use our supply chains to do the following, right? The last 30 years was the era of supply chains. So what you did very simply as a large corporation, Shaun, is you put the labor-intensive part of your business in China to avail of low wages, if you're a large multinational, and you put the capital-intensive part of your business in Europe or the United States to avail of the skilled labor force and the capital infrastructure, right? And you played the game. And what that did was it drove down prices because we were getting deflation from China, okay? It meant that supply chains were very, very long, okay? So it might start in New York or London or Western Europe, but it ended up in some remote place in China, okay? That's over. That is over. Because now supply chains in the past were driven, Shaun, by two things, price and the algorithm, okay? So basically, nobody cared who they were doing business with as long as it was cheap. This is all going to be replaced by what I would call relationship capitalism, okay? That people are going to do business with people they know, like you and me, Shaun. We've been doing business for years with people you know. No, seriously, that relationships will count for much more, that trust will count for much more, that price will count for much less, okay? European and American supply chains to China will be truncated dramatically, not just because companies will feel a little bit iffy about being exposed there, but also because they too will get the patriotic tap on the shoulder by the insiders to say, listen, guys, if you can put your supply chain somewhere else, please do it in the name of the nation. That means two things, Shaun. One is that inflation in the manufacturing sector will rise, and two, that the Cold War between China and the United States will be crystallized. Because part of what kept the Cold War very, very lukewarm was the fact that we were all traveling, like every time I'm traveling abroad, when I was traveling, because it seems a long time ago, there'd be Chinese people all over the place, etc. That's now going to change, I think. And supply chains are going to become much shorter. The Americans will become more aggressive. And I divide the world into two dates, right? The day the Berlin Wall came down, which was the 12th, 11th of November, 1989, and St. Patrick's Day 2020, right? So from the Berlin Wall coming down 1989 to St. Patrick's Day 2020 is globalization, long supply chains. We're all in this together. China is a source of materials, wages, and a source of supply chain options. Now that's going to change. And that's a huge change, huge, huge change. I mean, we've already seen it in Hong Kong, Shaun. Now, the interesting thing for you guys in Africa is, will this play out in Africa? Will the new Cold War between China and America actually hotten up in Africa, where the Chinese are very present? I mean, the Chinese checkbook diplomacy in Africa, not just in South Africa, but in East Africa, was phenomenal, up in Ethiopia and Kenya, So we've an interesting situation that Africa may well become the crucible for this new Cold War between the United States and China.
Thank you. And moving across now to Russia, one of your favorite topics. I guess two things there. One, of course, is the oil war and your thoughts on that. And the other, of course, is election interference.
Well, I think that we'll answer the first one first. I don't think anybody can suggest that Putin will be more influential on the American election than Trump. Okay, the most influential person in the American election is Trump. Okay, I think the Russians are just going to sit back and watch it all happen. The Russian expression, in geopolitics, the Americans play Monopoly, the Russians play chess. So they're figuring out where they're going. I mean, what the Russians have done amazingly. Let's think about this, Shaun. The Russian economy is no bigger than the combined size of Netherlands and Belgium together. Okay, it's small, right? Okay, yet it has managed to project its power all over the world. Not only project its power, but has managed to fill the vacuum in the Middle East that the Americans left. And that is a phenomenal result off the back of very meager resources. But what the Russians have shown they're not afraid is they're not afraid to put their own soldiers in harm's way. The Russians are not afraid to get their own soldiers killed in the name of Mother Russia, far away from their own country. In the Middle East, what has happened to the United States is that nobody's afraid of them anymore. They're disengaged, and that vacuum has been filled by Russia. And so now we see a crazy alliance of Saudi Arabia and Russia together on the oil market. I mean, that is a phenomenally strange place to be. Both of them have a long-term interest in destroying American shale. This is quite interesting. And both of them have come together despite their profound differences on Iran, which is a friend of Russia's and a mortal enemy of Saudi Arabia. But we are seeing Russia play the game that it's always been good at playing at, which is exerting the most geopolitical influence off the back of the least resources. And that's quite an achievement for Moscow's fine black art, if you want, of diplomacy. And they're playing the same game in Venezuela now, and they're playing the same game with Cuba in Venezuela, and they're kind of annoying the Americans on what the Americans will regard as their near abroad, the sort of the underbelly of America. We forget that Venezuela is a few hundred miles from the United States. It's not far. And the Russians are playing that game, but I don't think the Russians are going to do anything other than watch and wait. They're going to have to take sides on this new Cold War. that's a big dilemma for them, because on the one hand, they want to be close to China. On the other hand, they quite liked being at the top table with the United States as an equal at certain levels. But I think Russia is just going to play the game. But again, like, let's not forget that Russia's got its own internal problems, which are phenomenal. And I'd say Putin's a little bit annoyed that he didn't get away with that lifetime presidency trick he was trying to pull on the 22nd of April. But so the Cold War between America and China is the really interesting one. And it's a hard one to see. The interesting thing about the Americans is one can argue that America needs an enemy to galvanize itself in order to get through this. And the United States, when the enemy was the Soviet Union, was a place that was quite at ease with itself. And maybe creating the enemy of China will again allow the Americans to recover and grow and have this renaissance that they talk about. I'm not so sure. But for us non-Americans, it's the big takeaway, the big takeaway.
Thanks, Dave. And I think on the call today, there's a number of people who would be very interested in your comments about emerging markets. You've touched on the South Americas and many others. We've discussed oil, but I guess with emerging markets, COVID has hit them particularly badly because many of them are obviously commodity-based economies, and of course, commodity prices have plunged. What do you see as solutions for these countries, and do you think the IMF will be involved or could get more involved than it currently does?
I think it's a very good question. I think it's unsustainable, the status quo for emerging markets. When I say emerging markets, I'm talking Turkey, South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia, India. We're not talking about small countries, we're talking about huge, incredibly important strategic countries. The idea that we will consistently have you guys terrorized by your current account deficits, by high penal interest rates, by weak currencies, which prompt, you don't have to explain it, but the weak currency falls, you get capital flight. The capital flight causes the rate of interest to rise. The rate of interest to rise, that undermines your growth rate. Undermining your growth rate means your tax base looks smaller and smaller. That means more capital flights because, this is a profoundly unsustainable, unfair and unjust way to run not half the world, but 70% of the population of the world. We saw it in COVID. The first thing that happens, irrespective of how many dollars the Americans print, the dollar rises in value. Okay. I think we need a new Bretton Woods type system post-COVID, a global system, which is the reason I hope a Democrat wins in the United States, because I think we need a new global thought process. It is inconceivable to me that countries that are not in the hard currency zone of the euro, the yen, or the dollar will consistently experience capital flight and consistently have to face austerity in the face of austerity. This seems to me to make no sense. And for us, Europeans and Americans, the invoice is mass migration. There is no free lunch for us, right? The idea that we can sit here and look down from our lofty northern perches and say, oh my God, Brazil's just had a currency crisis. Argentina's had one. South Africa's had one, parts of Africa had one, Asian tigers have had one. The long-term implications of that is that people will come here, that we will get huge levels of migration. And I think that will be the reason that America and Europe react and say, hold on a second. Now, you asked about the IMF. You've got like special drawing rights. You've got various different ways in which the IMF, financed by the rich countries, can stabilize the exchange rate, interest rate, current account balance trilemma of emerging markets. I think this has to be fixed. So I think, Shaun, I would be quite confident that it will be fixed, but it demands global thinking. And if the one thing COVID has actually shown us is that we're kind of all in this together at one level, and we cannot no longer regard ourselves as just isolated places that pick and choose the best bit of globalization and leave the worst bit to be solved by the poor countries. So my sense is that the IMF has a role. My sense is that special drawing rights have a role. My sense is that a beefed up World Bank has a role. I know for lots and lots of people, these are institutions that failed, okay? But we need global coordination because it is simply unjust, unfair, and uneconomical that large parts of the world are terrorized by the bond market. Do you remember Carville, who was Clinton's right-hand man, the raging Cajun, James Carville, said, if I'm reincarnated, I want to come back as the bond market, okay? He says, because it terrifies everyone, right? I don't think, the problem is the bond market no longer terrifies us, but it terrifies you, okay? The difference is between an emerging market and a developed market is we no longer have current account deficit crises, which we had in the 90s. We don't have them. We have exported those crises to you. It is not conceivable that you will continue to entertain this. So what do? You bring in capital controls very clearly. You know, these things are all coming if we don't try and get a handle on emerging markets and understand that since 1990, or certainly since the late 1990s, since the Asian crisis, emerging markets have gone through these boom bust, boom bust, boom bust. Capital comes in, capital leaves, interest rates go down, interest rates go up, currencies go up, currencies go down. That's not a way to grow the economy. So we've got to think differently on that. And you know, the interesting thing, we were talking, Shaun, at the very top about how, you know, this is an unconventional recession, which I call a great Pandession, but unconventional dilemmas demand unconventional responses, Shaun. And what was good for us in the last 20 years is no longer good for us. And the interesting thing in crises is that ideas that used to sound quite radical end up sounding pretty normal. So basically what happens in a crisis, what used to be radical becomes mainstream, and what used to be mainstream becomes redundant. And we've got to see it in that continuum and that fluidity. So it's a time for new ideas, definitely.
Great, and I think that's a good way to sum up, you know, kind of your view on Pandession and how we get out of it. There have been some questions. I'm going to pass them to you, and actually one comes back to Ireland again, as we started. The question is from James, and he's asking, what is the future of Ireland in the context of Brexit?
It's fantastic. It's unbelievably good. We're going to win the World Cup. It's all ahead of us. It's just around the corner. What I will do, James, is I'll tell you, I think Brexit is, I've always thought that Brexit is a huge plus for us, because when your neighbor goes mad, all you've got to do is do nothing and you look very sane. And in a world of mobile capital and truncated supply chains, small countries that provided safe havens for international capital, which we did, I think will do quite well. And I think Brexit will just expose these. What I look at is that since Mrs. Thatcher came to power, Britain has been involved in a culture war, whether it's on the left or the right. And those chickens have come home to roost now. And I think Britain will take some time. I don't think Britain will be an interesting place to invest capital over the next while. I really don't. And I think that countries around it, like Ireland and Netherlands, will benefit quite well from this. But if I could just say one thing, Shaun, in terms of policy, globally, what's really important for us to appreciate is that the massive spending, the massive fiscal expansion, and the massive monetary expansion that we've seen is the new normal. Okay, we're not going back to a separation between monetary and fiscal policy. This has huge ramifications for markets, for inflation, for exchange rates. That basically, when you drop interest rates to zero, fiscal policy and monetary policy become one and the same thing, right? So what the ECB and the Fed are doing is they're basically saying to the governments, look, print as many IOUs as you want, we will finance you. That is the sort of war economy that we saw in the Second World War, okay? Where basically the central bank is profoundly and absolutely subservient to the state. Now, the Europeans are doing this in a sort of a jiggery-pokery way because we don't want to admit that. The Americans are just doing it flamboyantly, saying that's the way it is. And that changes the way in which policy is going to look. And I would say, you know, this new MMT stuff in the States, the modern monetary theory, which has been championed by the left of the Democratic Party, those guys around Bernie Sanders. Don't be surprised if that becomes the new normal. Big changes are coming in the monetary field, which will be very dislocating for markets, because markets can't understand that. Where, you know, basically there is no fiscal policy, there is no monetary policy, there is state policy. And that's why the interesting thing is, on a policy perspective, the West may well, for the next 2 or 3 years, look more like China policy-wise, economic policy-wise, than we think. China operates a dual interest rate policy. So there's one interest rate for depositors, one interest rate for borrowers, right? It operates state capitalism. It takes over companies that are in trouble. All this stuff is in the mix. And we shouldn't think that we're going to go back to where we were, you know, the last time I was in SA, for example. It's not going to happen. And that's an intellectual nut that we need to crack in our own heads.
And on the topic of SA, Sophia asked, in your view, knowing South Africa well and also the number of the other emerging markets, what you believe and who you believe is going to be the winners out of the basket of emerging markets, and what is required, maybe more specifically relates to South Africa.
Well, look, my sense, and I've always said this, Shaun, is that South Africans are far too harsh on yourselves about what you've achieved, you know? So economics is a reflection of the society, okay? And your society, think about what's happening in the United States right now in terms of race relations, okay? And think about what you have achieved and where you came from in terms of race relations, the society. I know it might sound a cliche now, the Rainbow Nation, all that stuff, right? These are phenomenal achievements that come at a price. And that price, of course, was a certain amount of capital flight, a lot less than what it would be had it gone the other way, and a certain amount of slow progress towards, I think Martin Luther said, the great arc of history moves towards progress. Martin Luther King, that is, not Martin Luther the German, right? And I think that he's right. So I would always, when I speak to friends up here, say, never underestimate what the SAFAs have achieved. It's quite amazing, okay? But now you've got to think, okay, what's the next play? Clearly, South Africa needs the continent to become much more vibrant. I think the continent needs significant manufacturing industry. I think there's a great play for Africa in this diminution of China in the game, right? So let's think about it, right? What South Africa, but particularly Africa in general, lacks is manufacturing industry, making stuff. There's no evidence over the last 400 years of countries becoming permanently wealthy without a manufacturing base. And I begin that with England and the Industrial Revolution, in Germany with its Industrial Revolution, which spread out to the rest of Europe, okay? The United States with its Industrial Revolution, China with its Industrial Revolution, right? The Asian tigers with their Industrial Revolution. You have to make stuff for export. Now the question is, could Africa play the same sort of trick that Ireland did over the last 40 years, which is import other people's industries, provide a safe haven, a cheap safe haven for other people to export. Those other people who are looking twice at Asia now and thinking, maybe I don't want to be there, okay? So I would think if I were South African, interestingly, just not because I'm sitting here in this rain-sodden island, but the rain-sodden island has done something quite good, which is it's gone from being poor to being rich in a generation. That's what we all want to do, right? Okay, we still behave like poor people, thanks be to God, right? Because they're much better fun, but we have more money in our arse pocket. But the opportunity now is the world's axis is shifting. China is going to become less a crucible for Western capital. Western capital will want to go somewhere else. Where does it go? Where is the place that is most obvious a manufacturing base? It's actually South Africa, okay? In the world, in terms of you have cheap resources, you have cheap people, you have sufficiently sophisticated infrastructure, you have trade agreements with everybody. All you've got to do now is attract in the capital. And how you do that is you make it cheap. So do what Ireland did. Don't tax it. Don't tax capital. And it'll come to you. So to answer the question, I think that strategic thinking and long-term thinking could easily position South Africa to do very well. But you will not do well if you depend on this short-term nonsense of the markets, you know. And by that I mean trying to cut your current account deficit, trying to expand your tax base, worrying about your exchange rate, worrying about adjusting interest rates. All that Mickey Mouse game is over, because that only simply leads countries into this downward spiral where interest rates rise, tax bases fall, currencies fall, interest rates rise sufficiently, capital leaves the country. You've got to come out with a big strategic plan, and it can't be copycat. It has to be bespoke to yourselves, but you can do it, definitely.
Great, thank you, Dave. And I've got one final question, a very important one. It comes from Rob Johnson, who's our head of investments. Two things. He wants to know, are the pubs open in Ireland, and how do you drink with only 6 people in a pub?
Rob, listen, man, I'm going to take you. In actual fact, that was the discussion with the mother-in-law yesterday in Belfast. And it was the only discussion, was basically, how in Jesus' name are we going to drink properly when we can't talk to each other, right? I will tell you what, Rob, I will keep you updated I'm going to put you in a WhatsApp group, okay? And the 29th of June, the pubs are open, okay? And everybody is trepidatious as to what does that mean. But I don't know about you guys, but we've been drinking our heads off at home here. Have you been at the same carry-on? I mean, our family now, if we weren't alcoholics, are now officially on our way to AA to do the 12-stage rehabilitation. But tell you, we will be open for business. And you know what we should do, guys? You should come to Kilkenomics. We're going to go ahead this year. First week in November, Kilkenomics in Kilkenny, economics and stand-up comedy in a pub. All the Safas are welcome. And are we going to have the autumn internationals in the rugby, or is that over? Maybe you guys will even be up here to play rugby. And frankly, we don't want to see you. Do you have a B team or a C team we can actually play? Anyway, guys, listen, it's been a pleasure.
Dave, thank you very much for your time. That was very insightful. And just to remind the listeners and viewers that this will be recorded and available on our website and the podcast channel. Thank you very much, David.
Thanks, guys.
All the best.
See ya. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.